Hey guys, welcome back to the ceramic studio. You can tell maybe by the color in some areas of this piece that I'm kind of hitting the end of the workable life of this piece of clay. I'm about 3 or 4 carving sessions in here, and what I've done so far is I've opened it up today and I've started to refine some of the edges, and I've brought in a couple extra tools that you may find sitting around the house. So I'll kind of walk through a couple things about how I got my piece here today, and then I'll demonstrate a little bit more about the sort of time involved in getting there. So in order to open up my pieces, open up some of these sort of negative spaces in this design, I've got to go back to these areas that I've drilled out and carefully with the X-Acto blade, or maybe one of the tools that you made, or something you found around the house, plunge the blade into those areas right around that drill hole. And because the clay is stiff enough now to hold its form, it's starting to cut a little bit more like really soft wood or something like that, so or almost like a styrofoam consistency, so it's able to hold up to this kind of precise, careful work with a really sharp edge. If you prefer to work in the clay wet, you could use maybe a little bit more of a blunt tool to do these cutouts, and then when the clay stiffens up, go back in and refine them. So you can see how I gotta be really careful to sort of cut right up to the line, but not past it, and then just kind of work those clay bits out through the back side. I'm going to flip this thing over for a second just to kind of take a look at the back side of some of these areas. You may want to come in just so that your tile lays flat after kind of doing a plunge cut or removing some of that material. Just kind of refine some of those edges. I actually kind of remove a bit of a chamfer or a bevel cut off the back, and I'll come back in with a sponge later on and refine those, but just so that the clay tile still continues to lay flat. Now the other thing I had to do in order to even make this possible was to spend a little more time refining some of my forms, some of my shapes, because as I was working with it, they were getting either out of shape, or maybe I wasn't as precise as I could have been or should have been as I was cutting them out the first time. So I'm laying my template back in and just refining some of those shapes that I may have been a little bit wrong on. And it turns out that it's a good thing. I'm just going to keep using this template. I keep coming back to it and back to it and back to it. The other thing I could do is use that milk bottle top to continue to refine edges in that way. It's the same, should be the same radius. So I'm just kind of come back in through there, and each time I get a little bit closer to my final cut lines. And as my clay is starting to get more and more and more dry, I'm not going to have too many more days worth of fixing to do on this, so I got to get my lines pretty accurate now. It's really difficult to get lines in clay perfect right out of the gate because of how soft it is. So if you end up having to come back to your templates repeatedly over and over again, don't get frustrated with that. Once I did some more of that refining, it was much easier to see exactly where my cutouts would be or where they should be. So the last thing that I'm going to end up working on in this piece is to do some of the actual relief edging. For that, I'm just going to use this old kitchen knife, and I'll use this area right here as an example. It's a little rough right now, so the first thing I'll do is sort of scratch some of that clay out, but then I'm going to undercut it just slightly to see if I can't get that to throw a little bit of a shadow. So the first thing I'll do is sort of use the tool in a scraping fashion just to sort of scratch along the sides, smooth out any clay that may have been too rough. And then as I'm refining that inside edge, I'm using the tip of a metal tool to undercut just underneath the piece, so that this sort of tricorn piece of the weaving really kind of creates the illusion that it's dipping up underneath this other one. And I'm accomplishing that just by running the blade along the side and undercutting this edge just a little bit. It's sort of a slow process because it's all in this repeating design. I just have to do the same thing over and over and over again, but slowly, slowly I'm refining those edges and getting them tighter and tighter and tighter, closer and closer and closer to where they'll eventually all be right on. So at this point in the process, after I've completely opened it up, the piece of clay is very, very fragile. What I've done is I've turned it over and very, very lightly with a sponge, just kind of run it over the back, and cleaned up any tool marks, and lightly hydrated the clay a little bit, maybe roughed over any of those edges that still may have been left over from the metal tools. I'll turn it over and give it one last kind of smoothing on the front side as well. And all the other work that we'll do, we'll save until this piece of clay is greenware. Now, this is also the point where if you were hoping to add any sort of texture to your piece, while it's right at this moment, just before it completely dries out to greenware, that's where I would add my texture, and I'll cover that in the final tutorial up next.